Sorry. I think I was muted. I greet everyone first, and then I saw that I'm a double muted here. Thank you for putting the comments there. I was indeed muted. Again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Cloud Launch and Learn session. Today we are going to dive into the security portion of the cloud and how hackers are trying to exploit that. But we have Brian from CISO from Mythica is going to share us some interesting stories and stories from the field where he actually confronted those hackers and helped the customers. So anything special I would say special, anything memorable that you have, Brian, in last 2 years that happened that you want to share today before we
Yeah,
jump to the slides?
yeah, we've got some amazing stories to share today. We're going to talk about some cloud incidents that we've come across,
Yeah.
and some things that are a little bit adjacent to it as well. So, some really interesting stories.
Awesome. Sounds very interesting. I hope everybody is tuned in. Without any overdue, I'm going to bring the slides and Brian, stage is yours.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And I'm connecting from a hotel. So, just to save on some of my bandwidth, I'm actually going to close up the video screen there so we can just focus on the slides. We have some really cool stuff to cover. As the title states, it's Hack the Cloud. Attackers love blind spots. But at Mitiga, and this is definitely not going to be a sales pitch, but just so you know where I'm coming from, we're a cloud detection and response company that also does incident response for clients all over the world. Incident response as it relates to cloud issues. So cloud infrastructure, identity, SaaS applications, multi-cloud, anything that relates to that, that's really our forte. So we've got a lot of really cool stories to share. But also, there's some sort of adjacent stories that go with this as well that have to do with like wireless and even XIoT. So I thought I'd share a little bit of that too, just to kind of mix it up a little bit. So hopefully you like it. Let's just go ahead and jump right in. A little bit of background about me. I've been in cyber for about 30 years. I've worked in over 60 countries. I've had 8 acquisitions and a couple IPOs, so I guess I can't keep a job. As my girlfriend likes to say, it's about I've gained about 5 pounds per company. So I've written a couple books. My last book was with the former deputy director of the NSA, and I did a documentary on cyber warfare with the former head of the NSA and the CIA as well. So I've been in the industry for quite a while. Some of the companies I've helped build, Riptech, ArcSight, Imperva, Solera Networks, my last company, just sold to Google. And I sit on the board of a number of companies, and I'm also an investor and an advisor. So anyways, that's enough about me. That's what I do, and just been doing this for quite some time. The agenda is pretty simple. I'm going to start off with a little bit of non-cyber stuff just to get everybody going here. I like to share a little bit of history at the beginning. Hopefully you'll find it interesting like I do. Then we're going to talk about targeting the unknowns. And for the sake of today's presentation, I really wanted to focus on wireless XIoT, and of course, the bulk of what we're going to cover is cloud. But I wanted to share some other use cases because it's weird to think about security in a silo. We'll talk a little bit about mitigation, and if there's time, I'll open it up for Q&A. I know we have about an hour, so I want to be respectful of folks' time. But if for some reason you have some questions, we're not able to get to it, you can go ahead and contact me. My email is on the slide, but it's just brian.contos@mitiga.io. You can also reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to chat with anybody after the fact. So let's just jump in. So we think about the history of innovation and just civilization in general. And we've had, these periods where some form of innovation has caused a quantum leap. And has really kind of defined where we are today, and standing on the shoulders of the experts that have come before us to kind of build modern civilization. And one of these examples that I like to mention is the automatic loom. So in 1804, Joseph Marie Jacquard invented what would be arguably the first computer. This predated Babbage and A.L. Lovelace working with him to write the first logic code, etc. And it was pretty straightforward. It was used for making textiles, more specifically blankets. And if you look at what you see there, it's kind of the predecessor to computer punch card or even computer punch tape, which certainly predates me and probably predates a lot of you, but maybe our parents. But the idea was it has input, it has output, it has memory. It's mechanical, it's not electrical. And the inputs and the outputs were these punch cards that would give specific patterns that would then be incorporated into these blankets. Now, being the world's first computer, again, arguably, it was really all about, speed and flexibility and, to some extent, a level of automation. And the people working in the factory, they were a little concerned. They're like, oh my gosh, we're going to have our jobs replaced by this newfangled computer. Of course, they didn't call it a computer. And the reason was they were able to go from making maybe a dozen blankets a day to making hundreds using you could, per machine. You could have multiple machines. You just had to have somebody maintain them. So they all got together one night and they said, well, we're going to break into the shop and we're going to destroy these machines. We're going to just smash them to bits. And I always thought it was really ironic that the world's first computer suffered an insider threat. Now I've heard, but this is not completely substantiated, that the term sabotage came from this particular incident. But I've heard a couple of examples where that might have came from. So take that for what it's worth. So then we jump from 1804 to 1943, the world's first mobile phone. And there's me standing next to it with an iPhone for comparison. And mobile, because you could stick it on the back of a ship or maybe a flatbed truck, and you don't want to get too close to it. I'm sure it causes cancer and would certainly cause your hair to fall out. But it was sort of this, turning point now where the whole notion of wireless was really taking a big leap forward. And, it took a few decades to get to where we are today, but certainly this was one of the pivotal inventions that got us there. And then we jump into the first IoT device, 1989. Now, for those of you that are purists, there were some arguments that there was a soda machine that was at a university that was actually kind of arguably that, but most people agree that this toaster, which could be connected to the network and, get this, turned on or off, really became the world's first IoT device, which will become relevant further down in our conversation as we go through some examples. And then 2002 introduced the cloud, right? So we had AWS, they were first mover in that. And then pretty much roughly the same time frame, Google came out. And then a couple of years later, we had Microsoft Azure. And then now, of course, we've got Oracle and we've got IBM and a few others as well that play in the space. But that's changed things substantially. Now, as everybody on this call is probably very familiar, the way our universe works, you can't have good without bad, night without day, front without a back. So while we have these great sort of innovations, there's also people that exploit them. So a couple examples, like if we look at the first commercialization of the sea, the first recorded sort of records that we have showing people using the Mediterranean Sea, for example, for commerce was about 3000 BC. But it took about 1700 years before somebody said, hey, why don't we just get another boat and rob them at sea? So that was a pretty big threat window. Taking 17 years is a pretty big threat window. When's the last time that Microsoft or Adobe or anybody had a threat window that took that long to exploit? Then we go to air. The first commercialization of air was roughly 1859. John Weiss had this idea that we're going to use hot air balloons to deliver mail. It crashed and burned. It literally crashed and burned, and figuratively as well. But it took about 72 years before somebody did something truly malicious in the air, which was a hijacking in 1931, which then moves us to space. Now, there hasn't been a heck of a lot going on in space, to be honest. There's been some isolated things, but, Telstar, which was a communication satellite that AT&T owned, 1962, so just a few years after Sputnik. That was sort of the first commercialization that we saw in space. And it took about 53 years before we saw really anything, and it's still kind of a squishy use case. It was the Trula command and control bot that used some satellite infrastructure in order to operate, but I don't know. It's there hasn't been a lot, and that's just the way satellites are built, where you have a single base station connected to the actual satellite. Oftentimes the juice isn't worth the squeeze for a cyber criminal. And while satellite warfare might be a thing for nation states, again, there just hasn't been a whole lot going there. And then we consider cyber, right? So the first commercialization of cyber was really around 1988. That's when there was a whole bunch of users on NSFNet. and a whole bunch of users on MCI mail. And they said, hey, why don't we charge these folks money and then we'll let them send email to each other? What a concept. And right about that same time, 1988, was the Morris worm, which probably most of you are familiar with. If you're not, you can do a quick little Google search on it. Relatively interesting, using R commands and finger and things like that to spread a worm. And it spread much faster than they thought it was going to. When he wrote the code, it kind of got out of control. But threat window went to 0. So starting off with C, about 1,700 years, we got down to 0 for exploitation. So it just kind of shows you where we are today, and how every time we seem to innovate, there's somebody that wants to use that level of innovation against us, that technology against us. And we can certainly look at AI today. We can look at cloud, robotics, anything. Again, it's hard to have a good without a bad. Now, a lot of people want to see folks in security fail, whether it's cloud or some other areas. And in order to do that, they're exploiting what I like to call the unknowns. And these are areas where there isn't a great level of incident detection, incident response capability processes wrapped around these. Cloud's a good example. There's a pretty good infrastructure now for preventative controls, or what we used to just call hardening, to make sure that the cloud is as resilient as possible. But everybody here knows prevention only goes so far. If prevention was the end-all be-all, banks would just have a big safe. If they wanted to be more secure, they'd have an even bigger safe. But clearly, that's not the way the world really works. Some of the areas where they've shifted is certainly wireless. And when I say wireless, I don't just mean Wi-Fi, and I'll be a little bit more clear about that in a couple slides here. XIoT, or Extended Internet of Things, and certainly cloud, right? And certainly that's where the world's moving, so that's where the attackers are moving to. And they're happy to move to these locations again because of limited visibility. That's usually the underlying factor. Organizations just don't know what's really going on in these 3 areas. And they want you to believe that prevention is going to cover everything. And they pray that you're under-resourced and that you don't have detection and response. And they hope you're just going to say, well, we're just going to approach cloud security and XIoT security and wireless security the way we've been approaching security for the last 20 years, which usually isn't a great way to do it. In security, usually if you're doing the same thing twice, you're probably doing it wrong or in an outdated way the second time. So let's talk about wireless hacking. And again, I'm just going to touch very briefly on wireless and XIoT. I'm going to go deep on cloud, but again, it's good to show perspective here. Malicious actors love wireless. And again, not just Wi-Fi, but we've got Zigbee, we've got cellular, we've got Bluetooth low energy, we've got Z-Wave, and you can kind of read the differences here. And there's so many of these wireless devices out there. We're running into incidents now, and again, some of you may have been aware of this. I wasn't aware of this a couple of years ago, but there's solar-powered cameras that you can put a SIM card in that upload audio and video directly to the cloud. They don't have to be at all in your infrastructure. So you might have IPS and firewall and data security and this and that and all these controls in your environment. But if someone's able to stick one of these things up in your factory floor or in your executive briefing center or in the area where all your engineers are developing code, whatever the fact might be, it's not going across your network. It's not using your infrastructure. In some cases, it might not even be using your power. And it's doing all of this in a very sneaky way, a very inexpensive way. And maybe you find 1 or 2 cameras, but maybe there's 20 more. People using, AirPods. AirPods get lost all the time. If you see a set of AirPods laying around in an executive conference room, you're not going to think twice, because somebody could be using that for spying. There's all sorts of Bluetooth speakers that have video cameras built into them now as well. There's tons of Bluetooth microphones and other systems set up now where you can be, in a parking lot, across from a building, hundreds of yards away. So there's really a lot of capabilities here. And then there's purpose-built devices too, like pineapples and rubber ducks and things like that, OMG cables that are intentionally designed to be leveraged. So, you can walk into a building with a backpack and you spent maybe $1,000 and you've got 50 different tools in there that you could use for doing malicious things. So let's take a look at some of these examples. And again, some of you may be familiar with these types of wireless attacks. Some of you aren't. So for those of you who are, just kind of hang with me for this. So evil twin attack, a very popular one. And this is all it is. And I'll kind of walk you through this build. So you've got this victim's device here. This is on the left-hand side, right? He's got his laptop and it's going through a legitimate wireless access point and accessing some stuff on the other end. Great. So that's what we all want to happen. Well, then the attacker sets up a pineapple, and we saw a picture of that in that last slide, and does some AP access point mimicking and says, hey, the SSID and the MAC address that you're connecting to, that's me. And usually these things are pretty powerful, pineapples, and you can build one of these yourself actually pretty easy. What happens now is the attacker uses the Wi-Fi pineapple. It sends a deauthentication packet, which just basically, the user's not going to notice anything. It's just, oh, it went down, and then it's going to pop back up. But because it's overpowered, it's going to say, oh, I'm going to connect to you because you're a stronger signal. And by the way, it looks like you're the SSID and MAC address I was connected to before anyhow. So now the legitimate access points are taken out of the equation. And now the victim attempts to reconnect, again, all behind the scenes. It's going to connect to that duplicate SSID where, again, the pineapple in this example might be stronger. And now that information can be routed through. The attacker can see it. And the information, that user is still going to his legitimate location. So they don't know anything's going on, but all the information that they have is now being intercepted by the bad guy, and they're just forwarding off. So that's called the evil twin attack. Again, a very straightforward, very common attack. You can get these pineapples and you can build your own for a few $100s. It's really, really easy to do. Plenty of YouTube videos, lots of how-tos. You don't need a lot of technical skill. And again, you can start intercepting information from folks. And the other thing is, if you have all this wireless security in your network, you might not pick up on these things. There's very specialized solutions out there now that can pick up on these types of controls. I don't have a dog in this fight. It's nothing that, Mitiga builds or anything like that, or we're partnered with, but there are solutions like Bastille, for example, that can help with these types of issues. One more that I wanted to share is nearest neighbor. They didn't ask me when they named this attack, but I would actually call it weakest neighbor. And I'll tell you why, and I'll kind of walk you through this scenario as well. Kind of a similar story, but the interesting thing here is you can do a wireless attack from thousands of miles away. So this was actually based on a real incident that occurred and was recently made public. But basically, an attacker thousands of miles away does password spraying on Organization A's web server, right? But they can't get in because this organization actually has a functional multi-factor authentication, which is probably just two-factor authentication. But that's what we usually mean when we say multi. But they're trying to connect in. They're like, ugh, I can't get into Organization A over the network, so I'm going to have to find another path. So they pivoted, and they said, oh, you know what? There's Organization B. We're not really interested in them, but they're physically near Organization A. Maybe across the parking lot, maybe in the same building, doesn't really matter. But they go, okay, let's go ahead and attack Organization B. And they found that Organization B had a vulnerable VPN. So they used a basic RDP to compromise it. And when they got into Organization B, they found a laptop that was plugged into the network, but also had Wi-Fi capability, which quite honestly is pretty much every single laptop today, right? So you've got this laptop that they're able to compromise. So now the next step is they want to get, again, of course, into Organization B. So they use that laptop that they've accessed. Again, this is from a completely different country where they did this attack. And now they've gotten into Organization A's wireless network, and they're actually able to access it with some stolen credentials, right? And there was no MFA on the back end going through their Wi-Fi, just through the front door. So now they made a network connection, wired connection to get to Organization B, then used Wi-Fi to get into Organization A, nearest neighbor. Now, there was a little twist to this story. Organization B actually said, hey, we know that our VPN got compromised. We're going to go ahead and lock that down and get that fixed up. Great for them. So the attackers pivoted to Organization C, which was also physically in the same proximity, and used a very similar attack and then get back into Organization A. Again, this was made public not too long ago. If you do some Google searching on nearest neighbor attack, it looks like it might have come from a Russian APT, but they were within Organization A for a very long time, several quarters at least, before this was detected. Again, very, very simple, very straightforward attack where we have some RDP there, some password spraying, nothing really too complicated. But it just goes to show you these are areas within the environment that typically act as unknowns and can be very easily be exploited. Okay, enough of that. Um, the last examples I want to dive into are around extended Internet of Things, because we see a lot of that as well. That's another area that's quite unknown. So malicious attackers really love it. Now, there's a lot of these devices, right? Some studies show that there's about 3 to 5 of these devices per employee. So you have a company of 10,000 people, you could have upwards of 50,000 XIoT devices, right? And there's about 125 billion of these things connected by 2030. So there's a lot. It's a target rich environment. And you think about security cameras, printers, lights out management, smart racks, OT for, power and energy and transportation and oil and gas and all that. Uh, Voice over IP phones, security systems, and the list just goes on and on and on. There's just a lot of these things. Now, what makes them XIoT? Well, they're specialized hardware and software. But when I say specialized software, really most of these things are Linux. They're Ubuntu, they're BusyBox, maybe they're Android. We see a lot of that on the voice over IP phone side. They can be real-time operating systems on the OT side, which are a little bit more esoteric, but not that much more. But essentially, these are Linux servers. And a lot of times they're more powerful than probably what you have for your laptop. There's actually security cameras that are probably more powerful than your laptop in terms of processing, memory, storage, and capability. In fact, we were working with a casino that had a massive attack against their security camera infrastructure. And as you probably guessed, casinos have a lot of cameras, and they have pretty high-tech cameras. They've got the fancy stuff. They've got the good stuff. And I'd love to say there was some security control that picked up the attack, but it wasn't. It was whoever was paying the power bill one day said, "Hey, our power bill seems unusually high." Now, I don't know what the power bill is like at a casino, but my guess is it's pretty high. But this was high enough and an anomaly enough to make them take a second look to see what's going on. Well, what attackers had done is they had compromised these cameras, which again were just Linux servers. They had compromised these cameras and they were using them to mine crypto. And as we all know, crypto mining is a power hog. It eats a lot of power. And if you got tens of thousands of security cameras all mining crypto, that's probably going to increase your power bill by a little bit, right? So it just goes to show you the power of these devices. And I'm actually going to show you a hack. We're going to walk through one for a robot so you can kind of see what it looks like on the OT side. So almost all of these devices are network connected. There's some on the OT side that aren't, but that they're rather rare. In fact, usually most OT devices are hyper connected. So you've got TCP/IP, you've got wired and wireless, you've got serial over Ethernet, you've got Modbus, you've got DNP3, you've got Bluetooth. There's actually apps that you can download to do things like open DAM, close DAM. They're hyper connected with both their old stuff, like the serial over Ethernet, and the new stuff, right, like Bluetooth. So hyper connected for almost all of these devices. And there's a lot of white labeling, which makes this a big issue because you start seeing these attacks that are really starting going after like printers, for example. Printers are a great IoT device to attack because they're super promiscuous. They really want to be connected. Oh, connect to me via SSH. Oh, connect to me via TFTP. Oh, FTP, Bluetooth, wired, wireless. Use my ink, use my paper. They want you to connect. And they've got these massive hard drives, right? Where you can grep a lot of information. You can load tools. You can start enumerating shares in the environment, scanning, so on and so forth. They're great locations. And guess what? People have a lot of them. And guess what? They're never secure. So anyways, you have this attack that's starting to go after printers. You go, oh man, the same vulnerability is on this voice over IP phone and the security camera and this UPS system. Well, that's kind of a problem because now I can exploit that same system, not just on all your printers, but now on all your cameras, and I can hide there. So talking about, maintaining persistence and avoiding detection, man, if I'm sitting on hundreds of printers or thousands of cameras or, hundreds of voice over IP phones, what a great way for me to hide out. Good luck getting me out of your environment at that point. I mentioned APCs. There's an APC UPS in the top left corner there. If you go to Shodan and you do just a search for APCs, you'll probably find about 15,000 or so at any given time that are connected to the internet. And I don't really know what the use case would be to have that. Let's say some of those are honeypots. So maybe 14,000 of them are real, but I don't know why you'd want to do that, but there are. Now, we have a running joke in the company. If we ever run across an APC that doesn't have the default username and password, we'll buy everybody in the company a steak dinner. We've been eating a lot of chicken. Nobody ever changes the passwords on these things. And a quick Google search, you'll find that the default username and password for APC UPS is APC for the username and APC for the password, all lowercase, APC, APC. So of those 15,000 that you can find on Showdown, guess what? You can log into them with APC, APC right now. And usually people have an APC or a UPS rather, because they have something important plugged into it. You can sometimes shut those systems down. I'm not saying you should do that, but I'm just showing you how easy it would be to be able to resolve something like this. Now, here's some of the issues that we find across XIT devices. Default passwords. About 50% of the time, just like the APC systems, it's the default password. The other 50% of the time, the password was changed once, at the time of installation usually, because it had to be. So when the guy shows up with a ladder and a drill and some cable and sticks a camera in the wall, or he did it 10 years ago and they set the password, that's it. That's the password for life. End-of-life firmware. About 26% of the devices have end-of-life firmware. The other 74%, the average life is about 6 years. And we've got firmware that old. Again, remember, these are Linux systems. What happens? You're going to have a whole bunch of vulnerabilities. In fact, if you look at this breakdown, the levels of 8, 9, and 10, it's almost 70%. Almost 70% of these devices, and again, 3 to 5 devices per employee, have level 8, 9, and 10, which is probably most of you are aware means I can gain remote access with relatively little to no skill and take full control of that device. Again, and they're well known. These are Linux operating systems. They're BusyBox, they're Ubuntu, they're Android. So let's go ahead and show you a cool example. So we went ahead and we bought a robot. So this is a Fanuc robot. They're used for grinding and cutting and painting and sanding and a million things. And this was actually really fun to buy. If you've never bought a robot, I highly suggest you do. You make it do all sorts of things it's not supposed to do. You make it dance, you make it do push-ups, and it's pretty easy to be rough with it. It's a little bit hard to be delicate. So we took a while, because none of us were experts in working with ladder logic, to actually have it just touch the top of this can and come up and not destroy anything. Now you can control this through this wired handheld device, or you can use a PLC like we have in the racks here, like Rockwell or Siemens, or you can actually connect to it on the network. So what we found out is we just did a default build, connected everything up. We found out we could ping it. Okay, that's pretty cool. It's network connected. It got an IP address, used some DHCP. Let's go ahead and type in that IP address and see if it's running a web server. Again, we're kind of learning, and sure enough, it is. And given it's running a web server that looks like it's from 1992, but sure enough, it's still running a web server. So what could we find here? And this was great for us because we were kind of learning this as we're playing with this robot, saying, well, what's actually here? Well, we could see a summary of the configuration. We see the version of the software that was running, okay, when it was installed. That's pretty cool. So a lot of, sensitive information. Again, we didn't authenticate to anything. All we did was type in an IP address when we got on the network. We can say, oh, active programs. Well, that might be kind of cool. Let's look at what active programs are running. So here's one called CAN-LS. Okay, that's the program that we had written that touches the top of the can. And this is the logic. This is the x-axis, the y-axis, the z-axis, etc. We see the variables, and that's all it is. This is just a very simple coordinates, essentially. So I go, okay, well, that's interesting. Well, what else can we find? Oh, a remote pendant. Okay, pendant was that physical thing that we had in our hands. This is a virtual version of that. So now I could do everything that I could do physically with that wired device. It had like a 10-foot long cable. I can do it over this. And let's look at these protocols. Okay, well, it definitely has TCP IP. We know that. We're connected to the web server. Oh, and it's got an FTP server built in. Oh, and it's anonymous. Again, this is default configuration out of the box. No authentication, anything. So we pulled up the manual online, which was easy to find. And we said, oh, this is interesting. And it says here, if you see an anonymous username, you may be able to connect through FTP without credentials. Oh, well, that must be a typo. They would never allow somebody to just FTP into this device with absolutely no username and password, maybe the web server, but certainly not FTP. And then, oh my gosh, we can. So we can actually FTP into this robot. All right, well, can we do a directory listing? Let's see what's there. It turns out these guys don't have any kind of file folder system. It's all just one giant flat flat folder, essentially. So we said, let's FTP in. There's that file we saw before, can.ls, that had all the code to touch the top of the can. Well, let's see if we can get. Can we run a get? Can we actually grab that file? Sure enough, we can. So we're able to FTP in anonymously. We could browse what was there, and we can grab a file. There it is. Now I'm going to use this hacker tool. I call it Notepad. I'm going to open up that file, can.ls. I'm going to change the name to can crush. I'm just going to change one variable here on the z-axis from 205 to 305 millimeters. That's it. Just one integer change. Boom. That's all we're going to do. And then I change the program name to can crush. And when I save it, all I'm going to do is remember that this system likes to read files that end in ls. So can crush.ls. And that's all. Well, all I've done now is I downloaded the file to my laptop. I modified it. But there's no way they're going to let me like do a put, right? They're not going to let me actually put a file on the robot. Maybe I can grab it, but I should never be. Oh my God, I can. So it's actually able now at this point to put the file can crush. And sure enough, there it is. There's the original can.ls and can crush.ls. But now the file is just there. It's on the robot, but it doesn't necessarily mean the robot's going to run it. So we actually have to put this in the right location to make sure it says, oh, this is the default program I want you to run. Well, let's first verify that that's the file that we had there. So there it is. And remember, we changed that integer. So we'll just see, okay, yep, there's a file change date. And there it is, 305 instead of 205. So remember that little virtual eye pendant thing we saw before? Well, that's going to actually allow us now to choose the default program. So if we come in here to default program, we go to system, variables. And even if you're not familiar with real-time operating systems, you can probably figure out that a variable that's called def prog probably means default program, okay? And if it's called can, and guess what? We're going to change it to can crush. So I want you to run this. Now, these real-time operating systems, they usually reboot pretty frequently, once every couple of days or at least every couple of weeks to clear out the cache. And they're really fast. They reboot in just a few seconds, and there's a lot of blinky lights. So I just wanted to show you, if we do a reboot on this thing, you know, and as you guys understand, if we reboot this thing one time or a million times, it's always going to pull up the default program, which is only called. Well, there's the default program. It came up, and now the robot should be running the can crush program instead of the can. So as you might imagine, instead of being very gentle and just touching the tip of the can like it's supposed to, it actually crushes the can. So we're very easily able to quote unquote hack this. No username, no password, no type of access control. And then we wrote a program to make it dance, because if you have a robot, let's just be honest, it's fun to make it dance. So we did that. So this was a pretty blatant example, but think of it if you were like making a gear and it was supposed to be 4 millimeters thick and you made it 4.01 millimeters thick. It's probably going to pass QA. It's probably going to work, but it's going to create friction over time. And whether it's in a piece of machinery or a car or a tank or a plane or whatever, eventually it will break down. So just one very simple example of unknowns that people don't watch. So let's jump into the cloud now. Now, just like malicious actors love unknowns related to wireless and XIoT, they love it in the cloud. And the cloud has this mesh, which makes things really complicated. So you might have an engineer that's on GitLab or GitT or GitHub, where they've got some sensitive information, and maybe that gets compromised. But because that's got hooks into your single sign-on, they're able to get in through Okta. And because Okta is tied to your organization, now they can log into Slack. And from Slack, they're able to get access to Google Workspace or Office 365. They can set up some email forwarding rules. Maybe they can go to AWS and play with some EC2 stuff and grab some information from an S3 bucket, and then exfiltrate out that information. The thing about the cloud is, unlike in the XIoT and the wireless, instead of going after a thing, everything's meshed together. And the problem is most organizations, maybe they have some preventative controls that harden Google or harden Amazon a little bit. And that's great. Tools like Wiz, fantastic tools, but they're preventative controls. And they don't have visibility across identity. They don't have visibility across all the SaaS, and they might not have visibility across the multi-cloud. They might be great for AWS, but maybe not so much for Azure, and vice versa, right? So there's a lot of connectivity that makes this a real hotbed for malicious actors. So let's talk about the SaaS mesh marketplace, right? And application compromises. So even security applications get compromised. And here's an interesting example. So there was this developer that we were working with, or organization we were working with that had a developer, and it wasn't doing anything malicious. He had some code set up on GitHub, and he wanted to play with deep source. Deep source isn't a malicious tool. It's actually a security tool being used for some testing. And he said, hey, I'm going to set up deep source to be installed and test some of my code. So nothing malicious. And of course, he's a developer, so he did this with his administrative privileges, because why not? Why make anything more complicated than it needs to be? And he played with it for a few hours, lost interest. And he's like, you know what, this isn't for me. I don't really need this tool. But he never removed it, because nobody ever does. Once you get something connected, you just kind of leave it there. Okay, so now what happens? Deep source actually gets compromised. So the deep source application is compromised. Nothing specifically tied to this user or this organization yet. But once the attacker compromises deep source, they go, oh, well, what do we have access to? And they go, oh, we have administrative access to some of the GitHub instances for some of these organizations. Well, that's pretty cool. That's like source code. That's good stuff, right? Let's take a look there. So they were able to get access to customers with the connected application. Again, that mesh, if you will. Well, once they did that, they were able to download the customer source code and their AWS secrets. And now, again, you folks know this, but a lot of people, you say AWS secrets and people think, oh, that's passwords, right? Yeah, sure. It can be passwords, but it can also be different certificates and other types of credentials. It can be database calls and all number of things. So secrets goes way beyond that. So now GitHub actually notified folks of this attack. It became pretty well known and said, hey, your device was tied to this, your systems, we just want to let you know. This happened a couple weeks later. And what actually ended up happening to this customer is they said, look, we didn't know this happened, and it caused some major disruptions. They had to suspend their service with some of their customers. Some of their customers said they would only do business with them after they did a third-party audit, which can be very, very expensive, again, because of all the interconnectivity in the cloud. And their cyber insurance rates actually increased as well. And what caused this? The developer wasn't doing anything malicious, maybe a little bit careless, probably didn't follow best practices, but just because of that connectivity that is so easy to happen in the cloud, these types of things can happen. Here's one that we ran across with a crypto miner, which was embedded into a AWS AMI. And some of these terms, some of you might not be familiar with, so I'll walk through a few of them as we go through. So what if you want to run Windows 2008? Even though Amazon's like, no, don't run Windows 2008. We're not going to support that. That's been end of life for 5 years. But you're like, I really want to. Okay, well, you can if you really, really want to do it. So there's these AMIs, or Amazon Machine Images. Now, what some people may not know is, first of all, there's a ton of flavors, right? You can get Windows and Amazon's version of Linux and Ubuntu and Red Hat and this and that. So there's a lot of flavors you can grab. And some you can grab are even versions that are no longer officially supported by Amazon. They don't want you to run, Windows NT 4.0, for example. That's generally a bad thing. But not all of these AMIs are provided by Amazon. So if you look in that right image, if you know what you're looking for and you want to grab an AMI because they're very helpful, they're pre-built with the OS you want, maybe the configuration, and this one's optimized to be a web server. This one's optimized to be a database, and this one's great for Mongo, and this one's great for this, whatever. It's handy. Everybody uses them. It's very popular, very easy to use. Well, some of them are provided by Amazon, and so there's probably a little bit more faith that, it probably doesn't have anything malicious on it. That should be okay. But unless you know to look for that, which most people don't, you could grab an AMI that's just provided by Joe Bob's backyard AMI store, right? And you had no idea. So now you've got this AMI instance that you've grabbed with Windows 2008 for whatever reason that you wanted to run them for. And by the way, this one happens to have hidden Monero, a crypto miner, built in. A lot of crypto mining stuff built in these systems. So you got Windows Server 2008 R2. You think it's just going to be dandy for your situation, but it's got a crypto miner built into it. Now, what we find a lot of these times is there's two modes people like to use. There's the smash and grab, which is, look, you're going to find out that I got a crypto miner in here soon enough. So I'm just going to run as hard and as fast as I possibly can, mine as much crypto, do as much damage as humanly possible. And once you kick me out, it's fine. I've sucked as much resources as I can. The other one's the sneaky one. That's the turtle. That's like, I don't want you to kick me out. I want to stay here. I like it here. This is nice. And you're probably not going to notice me if I don't get too loud. Now, as a lot of you know, in the cloud, usually we don't have 100% control over our spend in the cloud. And I'm using AWS here as the whipping post, but this could be anybody. This could just as easily be Azure or GCP. So we don't have full control. So if something gets a little bit more expensive here, oh, maybe that was the other team, or maybe that was marketing, or maybe that was dev or somebody else, or Bob was trying something new. So we don't really scrutinize it that hard. So the sneaky way is a real great way to kind of detect that, juxtaposed to the smash and grab, which is probably you'll detect it hopefully within the first billing cycle, but if not, relatively soon after that. Here's another interesting one. So Microsoft 365, I use it. A lot of you probably use it. It's great. This isn't to smash them or anything like that, but here's something that maybe you don't know about 365. By default, Microsoft will store about 90 days of logs, which is okay. I would argue it's definitely not enough. I mean, when you do forensics in the cloud, if we go in for incident response, it's not like the old days when it was on-prem where you're like, oh, I'm going to take your server apart. I'm going to grab your hard drives. I'm going to image them. I'm going to do some forensic analysis on them. You're not going to go to Amazon and say, give me your hard drives. At least if you're out like maybe a Fortune 5, they would. But I think that's going to be a stretch, right? So what do? You have to look at logs. Okay, so you're saying I got 90 days of logs, which to begin with isn't really that good, but it gets worse. The way that 365 works is, yeah, you got 90 days, but days, you get 7 days of logs that are accessible via API. The other days, 8 through 90, you can get to them via PowerShell, but it's intentionally throttled because they're saying you can get it, but don't. And what we found when we go on site is if you want to get a month of data via the PowerShell, it's going to take you more than a month to pull it out. So it's just not good. So if you want more than 7 days, honestly, you got to be pulling that stuff off in near real time and storing it somewhere if you're actually going to get some value out of this, right? And that's not, again, I'm not just picking on 365. That should be the case for everything, for your identity controls, Okta and Ping, for your infrastructure that you've got. You know, when I say AWS logs, I don't just mean CloudTrail. I mean VPCs, I mean Elastic Kubernetes, I mean DNS logs and everything in between. That stuff all has to be grabbed. And I know it can be voluminous. There's inexpensive ways to handle that with distributed data lakes instead of trying to stick it in a SIM, which would be crazy because you've got high egress costs and high SIM storage. But anyways, you should have roughly 3 years of data across cloud, SaaS, and your identity controls. Well, in this case, they had an Office 365 compromise. How did it get compromised? I don't know, because their logs only went back 7 days, but we knew it got compromised. So we went in there and they had an email forwarding rule configured, right? So this is a really, really common thing for attackers to do, and it's a very easy thing. We all know how to set up an email forwarding rule. So that way the attacker got a copy of every single email that got sent through. And then they had an email filtering rule configured to say messages were sent back to a hidden folder so the target won't see what's going on. So pretty common tradecraft for these folks. Now, the attackers went another step further. They said, not only did we compromise Office 365 for this organization, not only did we set up some filtering and some email forwarding rules, but we registered some fake domains so it can masquerade as both senders and receivers. Interesting. Okay, so what's happening here? Why would they do that? Well, in this case, they would receive email, and then they'd forward it on from the fake domain. So the communication paths looked like they were going smoothly between senders and receivers for multiple groups. And they copy one email into the other and then send it off. So they did it in a very manual way, but it worked, and it allowed them to do the same in reverse as well. And now they can monitor all communication. So essentially what they were doing is they were the attacker in the middle. And this turned out to be a law firm communicating with an auction house, a buyer and a seller, and an authenticator. And this happened for several months, right? And the net result of this attack was the theft of a $15 million wire transfer. Most, not all, but most of that wire transfer was actually recovered, but all because of a simple Office 365 attack. Now, a lot of people are saying, well, they should be having MFA, and I agree. Again, MFA, most people mean two-factor, but we'll just go with that, MFA. And then you got these push notifications. Now, these are great. I'm a big believer in multi-factor authentication. It's certainly not the end-all be-all. There's lots of ways to circumvent it. And it's getting easier and easier. So it's just one step that should be taken. Should it be taken? Yes. Should it just be the last thing you do? Absolutely not. Especially with the push notifications. And a lot of systems have turned this off. Like in Microsoft, they no longer do the general push because you get push fatigue. And what happens is you get a bad guy that keeps on sending a push. And eventually you're like, well, something's going on. It's an API or I don't know what's happening, but I'm not going to say deny. I'm just going to say accept because I've gotten like 1,000 of these in the last day, right? So you get that push fatigue, and that's a real thing and a real approach. But attackers have actually gone pretty smart when it relates to this as well. So they can send a phishing email example to a user, and that user is now going to use the attacker in the middle infrastructure when they click on the link. And they're going to use it to go to a legitimate website. But what's going to happen is that attacker in the middle infrastructure is going to send those credentials and tokens that have then been grepped from that user back to the attacker. And now the attacker can replay that session with the MFA and get access now back to that legitimate website. And the way that most MFA systems are set up, they could have this for a week. They could have this credential for 90 days. It really just depends. But this is a really common way that they're using when people do have multi-factor authentication. So should you use it? Yes. Should it be the only thing you concern yourself with? Absolutely not. This is a real interesting one. This one had to do with MongoDB ransomware extortion. And then we found out that sometimes ransomware attackers actually lie. Who would have thought? So this is interesting because when you pull up an instance on Amazon, you start up something new, there's constant automated scans in the cloud looking for misconfiguration across the whole AWS range. And AWS is big. It's got a big range, about almost 2% of all IPv4. So that's about 100 million addresses, right? And not even talking about IPv6. But that's 100 million IPv4 addresses that are constantly being scanned under AWS looking for new systems that have popped up. And guess what? A lot of times they pop up and they're not secure. Who would have thought? So in this case, what happened was they had MongoDB. There was a vulnerability, and these attackers took control of that. Now, there's a couple different types of ransomware now. There's the ones we're all familiar with, where I encrypted your database, give me a Bitcoin, and I'll give you access. Okay, that's pretty traditional. Then there's doubled ransomware, which basically says, hey, I made a copy of your database, then I encrypted it. So if you want to get your encrypted stuff back, give me a Bitcoin. If you'd like me to not distribute this information on the dark web, what I copied, give me another one. Then there's triple extortion ransomware, where it says, I encrypted it, I copied it, and I'm going to tell everybody in the world about it unless you give me 3 Bitcoins, making this very simple. So that's actually happening a lot now. It's like, well, if I'm going to go through the effort to encrypt it, maybe I'll steal a copy too. And then maybe I'll take a look at it and see, well, who are your partners? What's in your supply chain? Are there regulatory folks I can tell about this? So on and so forth. And then the attackers claimed in this particular case that, hey, yes, we encrypted your database, but you know what else we did? We copied the entire thing. So when we came in, one of the things that we were able to find is, first of all, they had their MongoDB database set up to 0.0.0.0 for the bind. So as most of you know, that means I'm going to listen to everybody. If you want to connect from anywhere, anyhow, anyway, have at it. So it's equivalent of a any rule on a firewall. The interesting thing was this database that got compromised, it was just a test database. It wasn't a production. So they put it out there. The problem was when the engineers set it up for their test database, they actually used real data from their production database. because why not? It's just easy. I just kind of copy it over to this one. So they encrypted it, but they're like, oh, that's cool. You encrypted it, but we have a complete backup. It wasn't even our production database. So I don't have to worry about that from a traditional ransomware perspective. But they said they took a copy of it. Well, now it's a little bit more sensitive because I put real data on there, right? Of that data. So now it becomes a disclosure issue. And I've got to be concerned about, you putting this on the dark web or something of that nature. So when we're able to do analysis on this, you actually need some infrastructure to be able to steal someone's database. There's some network, there's some storage costs, things like that. You actually see stuff happening. And we're able to see in the AWS traffic logs is that they lied. They didn't actually extract anything. All they did was encrypt it, and they lied to them. And by the way, not only did they lie to them about that, but it was funny in the messages. I know the text is kind of small there, but they're like, hey, I know you're not supposed to pay terrorist organizations. Rest assured, we're not a terrorist organization. We're not governed by OFAC. So you can feel free to pay us and not feel like you're breaking the law. So that was nice of them to do the research ahead of time and tell them that they're not terrorists. But then they went ahead and lied and said that they actually took the data, but they didn't. So sometimes they lie, right? And in this particular case, no payment had to be made. No, they didn't have to report anything because there was no disclosure. Kind of case closed for this one. And good lessons learned for the developers. Maybe next time you throw a database up in dev, maybe don't bind it to 0.0.0.0, and maybe don't use production data for that as well. I wanted to take you through a quick little cloud hacking demo just to kind of show you how easy some of these things. And this is just using Metasploit, so very simple. So this is GetT, which is like GitLab or GitHub. It's just a data repository. But I'll just kind of walk through this instance so you can see how simple it is. So we're going to sign into this, and you set up whatever username and password you want to, just like you're logging into GitHub if you're setting up a new account. I want you to do that. Here's my repository. Nothing special. It wants you to actually set up a username and password. Well, on the left, I'm starting up Metasploit. And I'm going to say, use this exploit. And I'm going to use this specific exploit now that is designed for this version of GetT. And I said, okay, this is what I'm going to use. And I'm going to set my remote host. And I put the EC2 instance. I'm going to set my username. This is important. The username and password that I actually set up when I set up my account with no special privileges. And then I'm going to check. And it says, oh, version 1.16.0 is in fact vulnerable. Okay, so we verified that it's vulnerable. I'm able to use my basic username and password. So I'm setting my local host, I'm setting the URI, just all the basic backend stuff. Show me what I've done now. There's my Metasploit, and now I'm going to say exploit. Successful, right? Now I have a reverse shell. So within this reverse shell, if you're familiar with Metasploit or using any reverse shell, I can get my UID. Oh, I'm running as get. Okay, that's kind of cool. So I went from my regular Joe Blow user to now get. So now I'm going to run my shell. What's my host name? Who am I? Get, we already figured that out. Let's go to the root directory. Okay, I am in root. Let me do a directory listing. Okay, now I'm going to log into my Postgres database, which is the back end of GetT. And I can run SQL queries. I can go ahead and view and modify tables if I want. And just for fun, let's select all the emails. Okay, and let's select all the encrypted passwords. And if I wanted to, I can then just run those against some cracking tool, Rainbow Tables, whatever. So very straightforward stuff. So as we wrap up here, I just want to talk a little bit about mitigation. Very quickly on the wireless and XIoT side, it all comes down to visibility into this white space, into these unknowns. Wireless airspace defense is a thing now. That's becoming a big deal. I mentioned a company before, Bastille. There's a few companies that operate in this space. Essentially, you need to be able to track all of your Wi-Fi traffic and all of your other wireless protocol traffic in your environment, because they don't necessarily run in your environment. They run adjacent to it, like those cameras and little Bluetooth devices and things like that. And if you're in a SCIF or a secure data center, it's very binary. I shouldn't see anything. And if I see something, that's really bad. If you're in a large enterprise, you can start segmenting it. Okay, these are the things I expect to see, but I don't expect to see these other things. You can sort of have visibility into what's going on and respond to that. So Really cool thing to start taking a look at. When it comes to XIoT, just remember it goes beyond printers. There's cameras and phones and security devices, and on the OT side, there's a whole lot more. You don't want a static inventory of how many printers you have. You need some time of real-time discovery, real-time scanning of your environment to identify these, especially after Christmas, where a bunch of people got a bunch of cool XIoT stuff. They take it into the office, they plug it in. Maybe it's secure, maybe it's not, but you need to know it's there. Mitigation in the cloud, a little bit more detail here. This really comes down to, we know organizations have moved to cloud and SaaS. Attackers have quickly followed. It just makes sense. And I think everybody here knows that. The cloud is the new. Prevention fails, right? You can only get so far with prevention. You need to have the ability to detect things when people get past your preventive controls and then respond to those things. And the more quickly you can do that, the more you reduce the risk, the less time it costs, the less money it costs, so on and so forth. You should also look into having our IR teams, either outsourced or an internal team or some type of hybrid, so that can help reduce that financial impact. And you want what I like to call the panoramic visibility. You want to be able to look across all of your unknowns. So all of your identity solutions in the cloud, all of your cloud providers, your productivity suites, and your gazillion SaaS applications. You want to be able to correlate all that data, because no one's just going to attack Okta. No one's just going to attack Slack or even Azure. They're going to connect everything that's meshed together. That's the beauty of it, right? And what we have found, and this is a study done by IBM, it's not done by us, but organizations that do have more mature security posture and incident response programs defined have very clear and visible gains in terms of reducing the mean time. So it's just, if you are prepared and you have your processes in place and best practices and you make some investment in that, it will pay off. And finally, understand the art of the possible. I showed you some cloud-based attacks, some stuff we've run across. I showed you how easy it is. Hopefully you're walking away going, okay, I kind of get that. Turn on logging. A lot of these systems like Slack, for example, normal Slack doesn't even have logging. You need Slack Enterprise. Microsoft 365, 7 days ain't enough, right? You want to have at least 1,000 days of storage. If you've got Amazon and you're saying, oh, I've got logging turned on, that doesn't mean anything. It's not just CloudTrail. You need DNS stuff. Oh, but DNS is too voluminous and loud. Well, if you want to track things like Tor exit nodes, crypto mining, command and control, ransomware sites, etc., you need the DNS stuff turned on. You need Elastic Kubernetes. You need to be able to track workload information. So you want to pull in things from CrowdStrike and other sources like that. These are important to have. And I know you don't want to stick it in a SIM because the egress costs kill you in the storage, but don't do that. Start looking into distributed data lakes as a way to actually store this data. So you can kind of get this near real-time ability to collect the logs, do threat hunting, and augment that with some type of incident response. So with that, I think we actually hit time, maybe a little bit over. Apologize for going a couple minutes over, but I don't think we have any times for Q&A, but there's my email at the bottom, brian.contos@mitiga.io. Again, hit me up at LinkedIn, just Brian Contos, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions. So with that, I'll turn it back over to the team.
Uh, Thank you, Brian, for the presentation. If you want, you can open the camera. That was really interesting. We had a question from Andrew, while you were presenting. I didn't want to disrupt. It was pretty smooth presentation there. And there is a kind of one of the good questions there, generic, where to start. I know there's like probably 100 ways to answer this, but from your experience, if you had these three main points to focus for cloud first organization,
Yeah.
what might be those ones that you want to put the most energy in short term, and if there's something long term and best practices that you would advise?
Yeah,
uh,
I'll actually
yeah.
give you one. I'll make it really simple. It's really readiness. And what I mean by that is logging readiness and preparedness to deal with an incident. So come at it as the mindset that something malicious will happen. And when it does happen, how ready am I to address this? And that means, am I getting log information from all the sources I need to get it across identity, SaaS, and cloud? Am I storing that information in a way that I can actually leverage, right? That either I can analyze in near real time, or should something happen and I have to have an incident response team like Mitigo or somebody else
Yeah.
come in and do some research, that they actually have the information they can respond to, that's really a good place to start. So many times we go into organizations, they just don't have the log data. They don't have enough log data. They didn't even know that even in CloudTrail, there's 50 different switches you can turn it on and off. And that's a big deal,
Yeah.
because if you want to be ready to do a response and you don't have that log data, you don't even have table stakes. You're not even ready. It means if something malicious happens, you're going to have to pay the ransomware. You're going to have to lose your data. You're going to have this bad thing happen to you, and you'll have zero recourse. You'll have zero way to address that. So prepare in that way for logs. Yep.
Yes. And from my perspective, like if you are more of a framework kind of driven organization, there's like this. There was probably 2 years ago, there was big push towards zero trust, which says that assume the breach and make your plans based on that. So I believe that's close to what you answered. So it's
Yeah.
like assume the breach, think that you have the breach, what you are going to do. Do you have your logs available? Are they in the same part of the system, or you aggregated them in a way that hacker is not going to be able to reach them, right? Because part of the thing is that how much you segregate the system from each other in the case of breach, so that you
Yeah.
can isolate them and then basically treat them per isolation if possible, right? Because each breach, when it happens, it goes through the layers, right? There's like I'm not going to talk about, but there's like this big course about layered security and stuff like that. So
Mhm.
the more we slow down the attacker and can isolate them while buying time for us to respond to the breach, it would play to our hands to respond
Yeah.
effectively, right? So
If you want
what's your
something,
perspective on that? Yeah.
Yeah, if you want something more formalized, something that's pretty nice is the MITRE Cloud Attack Matrix. So most of us are probably familiar with MITRE Attack. They have one specifically for the cloud as well. It has the same look and feel. And that is played against your logs, essentially, how am I collecting logs? So again, maybe you don't want to turn on this type of logging, and that's a business decision. But you should know, if you don't turn on this type of logging, maybe you won't be able to detect data exfiltration. Maybe you won't be able to quickly respond to insider threat. So you know what you're giving up. You're saying, okay, this is going to be too hard or cost too much, or I don't want to use a distributed data lake. I just want to throw it into my SIM. So I have a cap on how much data and how much money I'm willing to put into my SIM. So I'm going to miss out on these things. So on a score of 1 to 10, with 10 being the best, maybe I'm willing to accept I'm only a level 3 when it comes to my ability to detect data exfiltration, right? I wouldn't suggest that. I don't think that's a good
Yeah.
approach, but mapping against the MITRE cloud attack matrix is a good way of formalizing your approach to making sure that your readiness is kind of at least on par with sort of best practices. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, that's really great answer there. Thank you, Andrew, for the question, and thank you, Brian, again for the presentation. It
Yeah.
was really eye-opening, especially for the people who are not involved in day-to-day with security, like developers, maybe some of the cloud engineers. That's really awesome. For the people who were not, lucky enough to be in this session and ask the questions in the chat, what would be the places that they can connect with you and maybe ask one or two questions from you or
Yeah,
to learn
absolutely.
about this? What
You can
would be
hit
your resources? Yeah, you would
Yeah, you
recommend.
can hit me up on LinkedIn, just Brian Contos, or just email me, brian.contos@mitiga.io, and happy to have a conversation. And if we have a lot of smart people at our company, a lot of great researchers in this space. So if it's something that I can't answer, I'll certainly get it to somebody that's better equipped to do it.
Yes, awesome. All right, thank you again, Brian, for your presentation. Thank you, everyone, for being here in the studio online, or you are going to watch this YouTube session later in the day. Have a great day, and thank you, Brian, for your presentation. Have a great
Yeah.
day too.
Thanks, everybody. Bye
Thanks.
bye.